It's 9 out here, Pass.
Hey, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Esoteric Lighthouse. We are a group of free and accepted Masons from regular and recognized Masonic Grand Lodges focused on the esoteric, occult, and philosophical lessons found in Freemasonry. This being a public forum, our views and interpretations are not legal or official statements or opinions of any Grand Lodge or Masonic bodies which we hold membership. All opinions, thoughts, and interpretations are solely of that of the individual panelist. All right, good evening again. We got a special treat for you from our own brother, Chris Lewis L. out of Hannibal Lodge in Maryland. He's gonna give us some insight on the Bronze Age. Sir, take us away. Floor is yours.
Thanks, sir, for the introduction. Let me share my screen real quick. And I'll go back to that original. All right, how's it look? Everybody can see everything?
Yes, sir.
It looks like there was a little freezing there. All right, cool. All right, so, sometimes you do a project and you kind of like trying to come up with the right name for it. Originally started as the Bronze Age, and then I started reading some other texts and things like that. And Dr. Ben Yochanan, he basically at the beginning of his book Africa, the Mother of Western Civilization, has stressed the importance of names. So I thought it was very important moving forward as to kind of revolve around that topic of the name. So the table of contents, see here, what was the Bronze Age? Where was it? Who were the Bronze Age peoples, and why the Bronze Age? Just real quick, there we go. So about my project, I developed an interest in history concerning the evolution of man and civilization. This had peaked as well when examining Africa and the Mediterranean due to the Minoans, also from conversations with brothers and entering Royal and Select Masonry. And for those who are familiar, looking at the opening and the closing, the certain names that are being used. So I was really curious as to, what that was about. Like, I had heard of those folks before, but what connection did it have to Royal Select? So I did some research of those peoples and who they were exactly. And that kind of led me down the road to peoples who interacted with them. And in some other cases where actually the ancestors or had shared some particular ties with those groups of people. So section 1, what was the Bronze Age? In the image right there, there's some Bronze Age implements. It is important to note that true bronze is a mix of copper and tin. We'll get into further detail in that later on. So according to Britannica, the Bronze Age was the third phase in development of material culture among the ancient peoples of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, following the Paleolithic and Neolithic periods. I'm talking about the Old Stone Age and the New Stone Age, respectively. And the entire Stone Age itself spans 2.6 million years. But when we start talking about that Neolithic period, we're talking about 10,000 BC, around that period of time. So the term Bronze Age also denotes the first period in which metal was used. And then this era saw increased trade, expansion, commerce out of Africa, colonization by Egypt, Phoenicia, and Ethiopia throughout Europe, the Mediterranean, the Levant, which is the Eastern Mediterranean, Western Asia, North, Central, and South America. So to be clear, I'm stating these things, that these things only happened during this time, that I'm not stating that, but I've reached the conclusion that the invention of bronze that fueled that Bronze Age was actually a culmination of earlier civilization. So when we look at civilization, I think a mistake that people have made in the past is that they think that these outcrops of civilizations and cultures just kind of like came out of nowhere. And my assertion is you had a common ancestry for these particular groups. You had different groups and different nations of people, but they kind of emerged out of at least a basic foundation of civilization. And There's also, you had this element of people who sought to separate the origins of these peoples and the Africans from their accomplishments. And so you find a situation where they're receiving these names, but these were not the names that those people used themselves, and they weren't even called those names by people during that time. You find people in, we could say, the late 1800s, early 1900s, start giving these folks names, and that was based on what they thought they should be called and had nothing to do with that at that time. And therefore, we started to see these people get disconnected from their origins. So, as I state here, I prefer to call the Minoans Cretans. And even the person, I keep getting a mental block in his name. I know that he's Arthur, the Sir Arthur out of England. He's one of the archaeologists there. And even he said that he did not intend for the name Minoan to stick, which was based on King Minos, who was a mythological king. He didn't even intend for it to stick, but it just ended up sticking and people just kept using it. But as I said before, I think it's better to call those the Cretan folks. And a lot of artistic depictions show the feminine Minoan women, very light-skinned, almost white, but the men are dark-skinned. So I thought that was strange. But anyway, moving on. So the early copper phase is commonly thought of as part of the Bronze Age, even though true bronze was only used rarely at first. And then during the second millennium BC, you had the use of true bronze greatly increasing, and they were utilized in tin deposits at Cornwall, England. And they were pretty much responsible for a considerable part of the large production of bronze objects, because of course, they knew where they could get the natural resource, and they began to produce more of it. And there was a great demand for that throughout the Mediterranean. So the age was also marked by increased specialization. And you had the invention of the wheel, the ox-drawn plow. And then from about 1000 BC, when they realized that they could forge iron, which was stronger and more durable, they started to bring the Bronze Age to an end, and the Iron Age began. So going back to this section here, where we talk about the tin deposits at Cornwall, England, were used, Massey has stated in the book of the Beginnings that the Phoenicians went to the British Isles to get the tin, to create bronze. And that's significant because it shows that not only were they aware of the natural resources in other lands that were distant from where they were, it's possible that they either had a positive trade relationship or they had colonized or inhabited that area, which has other implications, of course. But I think the latter seems to make sense, because I haven't seen anything where it said that there was an established culture there that was trading with the Phoenicians. Prior to that, you had kind of like hunter-gatherers, semi-nomadic individuals who kind of like moved around the area, but nothing on the level of, we have 10, we're going to trade that with you. So you also had several cultures, different regions, but they were all kind of prominent during that period of time. We talk about the Olmecs, spoke about the Minoans and Phoenicians. You had the Luwians, who were also called the Anatolians, who were in Asia Minor. We had the Indus Valley civilization, of course, we know where they are. And you had the people of Kemet. And so I was just looking at these different civilizations, and there were so many different similarities between them. So the possibility of them having a common source or origin had to be high. So the fact that all of them built in stone seems to be key to their common origin. And you see a lot of these structures, these stone structures, kind of like in that 6,000 to 5,000 BC range, originally going up. So you're kind of like talking about towards the end of that Neolithic period, within that Neolithic period. So in Central America, you had the Olmecs, who were considered to be a totally advanced imported civilization. They came into the region, they advanced everybody there, they changed the entire trajectory. They introduced an alphabet, writing, mercantilism, stone structures, right? They're known for building these huge stone heads. And then even in certain locations here in North America, you get the Anasazi building in stone in the American Southwest, that region. But it was to a certain level of sophistication that was not seen in that area before. And then when you go to Cahokia, Illinois, you have these huge mounds that, once again, this is my assumption because I haven't heard about anybody doing it. But if they excavate that area, I believe that they would find some stone structures underneath there, because I've seen the same thing when I went to Shenantinich in Belize. So you would see these huge mounds with grass over them, overgrown areas, and their archaeological commission would go in there and they would excavate the area, and you would see fully, intact stone structures underneath those mounds. So where was the Bronze Age? So this is a map here of the Bronze Age trade routes. As you can see, they go all the way up to England. And then as we go further east, you find yourself in, Southeast Asia, China, and they even had some land routes going through the southern part of Siberia and things like that. Just very interesting how these things were going during that period of time. And then I selected this map because you see the orange regions, right? Those are the areas that are considered to be states, right? More organized empire type civilizations and nations. The purple ones, of course, are further advanced. You can see Kush, you can see Egypt. They were further along, the Babylonians, so on and so forth. But it's interesting to see that you had colonization, those orange spots in Central America, as I pointed out with, the Olmecs. Then in South America, on the western coast, where you have Argentina and Chile, you have those orange outcrops, those colonies that were established. You get to the Indus Valley, that's like a colonial area. You go further east, almost to Japan, where it looks like hold on, is that, yeah, it looks like South Korea. You have another colony there. So you can see that there was expansion taking place from that area, that region, outwards, which is a result of the trade routes. So who were the Bronze Age peoples? Getting to the nitty gritty. So I named all those folks before. We even have to include the Ethiopians, and we're going to get into why. Because if we think about the names, we have to understand that many of these people were, of course, named after the time that they were here. And the people at that time used different names for themselves and for others. So a book that was recommended to me by brother Javon Grenaway, Drusilla Dungy Houston's book, Wonderful Ethiopians of the Ancient Kushite Empire, she stated in the introduction that next we come to the fact that the Phoenicians had called themselves Ethiopians, and that the Hebrew writers had given them the same name. And then you also reflect upon the strange relationship of the family of Kushite tongues to the so-called Indo-European group of languages, which led me down another rabbit hole. So I go searching for some information on Indo-European languages and Kushites and stuff like that. And I came across a study, actually a paper. It was an actual paper where this person, Berbiso and Gerba, they had studied what Joseph Bernal had came up with. And he had these two models. He had an ancient model, which had argued that Black Africans or Nilo Kush people had originated civilization. We could say that that's in the Ben Yochanan camp and Sheikh Anta Diop, right? And they ruled over Europe pre-classical Greek times, left their civilization, culture, and language. And all of those things had developed and evolved to the present condition. But Bernal did not describe them as Africans, but as Levantine, on the periphery of Egyptian and Semitic culture area, or sometimes Egyptians and Phoenicians, right? And then the second model is what Bernal had called the anti-Semitic Aryan model, according to unreported mysterious people who invaded the local Aegean or pre-Hellenistic people from the north, from which Greek civilization arose from the mixture of Indo-European speaking Hellenes and their indigenous subjects. And then later on, Bernal turns around and he rejects the ancient model because Afrocentrists had taken a hold of it and maintained that the ancient Egyptians were Black or nearly so, and that Europeans had derived their civilizations from Africa. So he came up with the third model, which was the revised ancient model. And it's kind of funny because he offers direct and indirect influences through Crete on Greek from the Afro-Asiatic in the third and early second millennium, whereby Egyptian and Semitic spoken by the settlers of the early Mycenaean period, which is interesting because they always couch it as if the Cretans were there, the Mycenaeans came in and displaced them. But now we're talking about this language here, which substantially modified the local Indo-European dialect. So, as we see in the next map, Bernal had to adjust his models even further. And the reason why I'm saying that is because if we look at the expansion and the migration of people throughout the world, you see about 100,000 years ago, people leaving Africa. And they're going directly into that area that they call the Levant, right? And then from Asia Minor, they're going into that area that's called, or the Aegean area, or Europe, or Iberia, so on and so forth. They're moving into that area, that region, 40,000 years ago, right? And you can see from there, that was 50,000 years ago, 40,000 years ago in Australia, so on and so forth. And my assertion is, if you had those folks there already, you have the development of language and culture ahead of time. So if somebody's coming in and they're displacing somebody else, if they had that common ancestry, you're going to see those similarities in the language. So the Exodus, some people say, occurred 60 to 70,000 years ago. Some state 100,000 years ago. Regardless of the fact, you had folks who moved further west and north, east, and south. So this is my assertion behind those similarities, because they came from that same region. And if we think about the Bible and how they talk about everybody spoke the same tongue, and then they start building Tower of Babel, and they're confounded. The language is confounded because whoever was the deity at that time said, you know what, you guys are using your powers for, not so good things. I'm going to confuse y'all, and I'm going to just scatter you based on language. But it's not like it's that much of a difference when they start looking at these linguistic similarities. So Massey, in A Book of the Beginnings, he really goes deep into Egyptian words and how not only are these words existing in other languages, but they're significant. They're not just minor words. So he has a chapter about hieroglyphics in Britain on pages 88 and 89. He's referring to these words like Ri, which is the reed pen and symbol described in hieroglyphics. He states the Egyptians made their pens and paper from the papyrus reed, and the reed is celebrated as composing the mystical characters of the Druidic writings. And you're going to see this reed theme continue as we move a little bit further. So there has to be a connection between them and another people. So then he also states that the leek or onion, the head crest worn by the Welsh as a national symbol, is one of the hieroglyphics. Leeks and onions were identified with the young sun god Aden at Byblos. So now we start digging in, to these similarities again. So the name Aden is of Semitic origin, which also appeared as Hathor in Egypt, Phoenicia, and Syria. Later, he's associated with Tammuz, Eshmun, and Osiris, aka the dying god, the one who must be sacrificed in order to produce more life. And then that's just one of, the attributes of Osiris. And then according to UNESCO, the ruins of many successive civilizations are found at Byblos, which was a name used by the Greeks based on bublos, the word that they gave to reed paper they would get from the same people. And Byblos is one of the oldest Phoenician cities and has been inhabited since Neolithic times. So here we get back into that stone building. So it's been closely linked to the legends and history of the Mediterranean region for thousands of years. And Byblos is also directly associated with the history and diffusion of the Phoenician alphabet. So now we start to understand the depth of that quote. And then we look at the ancient city of Baalbek, which was inhabited since 9000 BC, before being conquered by Alexander. We begin to realize that these people that we are calling Phoenicians, which was a term that was technically given them during the Bronze Age period, they existed and they were advanced way before that, like double that time. So according to study.com, the land upon which Baalbek sits has been inhabited for nearly as long as humans have practiced agriculture and more sedentary lifestyles, or since around 9000 BCE. It started as a small town or village, grew over the millennia until it was one of the most prominent holy sites in the ancient Middle East. So major construction, of course, first started on the Phoenicians. They erected this enormous temple to the Phoenician sky god Baal. Baal was one of the most important gods in the Phoenician pantheon, making Baalbek a popular site for pilgrimages from across the region. So Baalbek and Baal both remained important in the ancient Middle East until European incursions brought destruction and new rulers to the area. Basically, as we said, Alexander and the Romans. And then, but think about it, they were there since 9000 BC. Alexander comes along in 334 BC. So you're talking about almost 9,000 years undisturbed. So Baalbek was renamed Heliopolis, a Greek term meaning city of the sun, which it retained through the Roman times. So once again, we come back to what's in the name. So since no Greek person existed 10,000 plus years ago, the Phoenicians were already an intact advanced civilization. Who were they, right? So when we start going back through that time, we could say that even those folks who were called the Phoenician around that period, Houston says those people could have been the Microbians, who were a people of Ethiopia, who were called Phoenicians in the Bronze Age period. And Herodotus had described the visit of the ambassadors of Cambyses to them. And so his spies had brought presents to this king of the Ethiopians. They were a civilized people with their own laws and institutions. The spies brought a purple robe, gold, and perfumes, and a cask of palm wine, things that were very essential to Ethiopian culture at that time. So the term Phoenician came from what the Greeks would call them, because of this purple cloth, it was called Tyrian purple. That places us specifically in the area where Baalbek, Tyre, I'm just drawing a blank on the other city, but where those cities were, major cities in what they would call Phoenicia. And the Greek term here is phonikes, for that type of purple. So also, no one knows how the task of moving those large megalithic stone blocks that formed the foundation for the Temple of Baalbek even occurred, because once again, we're talking about the 10th century BC. So what's the name of these people? Had to be Cushite or Canaanite, because in Britannica, the Amarna letters, which were addressed to the Egyptian court in the 15th century BCE by Phoenician and other rulers in the vicinity, make reference to Canaan, right? In Akkadian, that's Kanana and Kanai, a region roughly corresponding to Phoenicia. So now we make the connection, because even in 1500 BC, they're calling that area Canaan, not Phoenicia. So further evidence, we find that in the World History Encyclopedia that the purple dye that's manufactured and used in Tyre for the robes of Mesopotamian royalty gave Phoenicia that name. And it accounts for them being known as the purple people. But then, once again, we get into that part where it says, in its time, Phoenicia was known as Canaan and is the land reference in the Hebrew scriptures. Emphasis of mine. So Herodotus also says Phoenicia is the birthplace of the alphabet. It was brought to Greece by the Phoenician Cadmus sometime before the 8th century BCE. And prior to that, the Greeks had no alphabet. The Phoenician alphabet is the basis for most Western languages written today. And the city of Gebel, hold on, I gotta see if my brother Akoni's looking at me. You know that city, right, brother Akoni?
Yes, I do, sir. Yes, I do.
Yes. So here we go, full circle. They call that same city Byblos. So they gave the Bible its name from that, the Greek ta Biblia, as Gebel was a great exporter of papyrus. That's why I was saying that reed is going to come back up again, which is also called Byblos by the Greeks. And it was the paper used in writing in ancient Egypt and Greece. So as we know, that's just not coincidence, right? These people are using these things for a particular reason, because that's what they have. That's what they know. So why the Bronze Age? So as I said before, I was watching the documentary Temple of Knossos, Kenosos. I was in my RSM ritual and I had questions about those words. And the temple itself, they said throughout the temple on the stones that they laid, you would see a double axe symbol on every stone. And that was very interesting, right? And then also throughout the whole temple complex, it was like it was dedicated to the bull, like the Minoans, as they called them at that time, were people who worshiped the bull. And so the double axe is an ancient symbol that predates the people who inhabited Crete, and it symbolized power and authority. And since it was used extensively in that temple, it marked that temple as an administrative power or authority. So looking at that symbol, because I've seen the double axe symbol before, I go into church where the origin and evolution of religion, and these signs and symbols are found in every country where the old stellar cult people had settled. And the portrayals on their temple walls were all iconographic, which make them absolutely and critically distinct from the solar cult people. And so he had seen one of the earliest names given to Horus was the great chief of the axe. And it was symbolized by an axe or a double axe or hammer. Might sound familiar there as well. We talk about mythology. And that was at first north and south. That's what the axe represented. He had come up from the south and cleaved his way to the north. So just so happens to be how the people of Ethiopia and Nubia moved from the south into Egypt. And then Diop states in African origin of civilization that the Nile Valley civilization, as the ancients and by the Egyptians themselves, it had originated in Nubia. And this is confirmed by our knowledge that the basic elements of Egyptian civilization are neither in Lower Egypt, nor in Asia, nor in Europe, but in Nubia, in the heart of Africa. Moreover, that is where we find the animals and plants that are represented in hieroglyphic writing. So we have a connection between those two regions. And then Diop goes on to state that an authentic hieroglyphic writing called Njoya exists in the Cameroon. And it's exactly the same type of writing as Egyptian hieroglyphics. So Ben Yochanan, Dr. Ben, goes on to say that in pre-dynastic, dynastic Kemet, Nubia, Kush, and Libu, which is also known as Libya, all had their earliest beginnings around the African Great Lakes. And so we can see, according to the map there, we have the Congo, Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia. But when we move up a little bit further, you see Ethiopia right up there at the top. So it's in line with what the Egyptians say about their origin. And it's further south than some people would think. But it connects the dots between those close relationships between Egyptian, Nubian, and Cushitic civilizations, because you can see that they're in that same region from moving from the south to the north. It also explains the dark-skinned nature of Nubians and early dynastic pharaohs. And even during that period of time, a pharaoh was able to solidify his power by marrying an Ethiopian princess or queen, however, it came to pass. So this also connects with the story of Horus and the north and the south. So the bull, which was prevalent, as I said, as well in Minoan Crete, has different connotations as well, but it's definitely connected to Apis and Osiris. And Apis was Osiris incarnated in bull form. That's how he was represented. And so originally, Apis the bull was considered to be the god of Memphis, Ptah, and symbolized the sacred life of Ptah. And certain folks who are watching this are familiar with Ptah, known as the Ancient One, very important god in Egypt. Also was attributed with the invention of the arts. Biblically, we could equate him with Tubal-Cain. In the Pyramid Age, he was a creator god. And he's also credited with creating all beings on a potter's wheel. And it's also useful to note that he was depicted with feminine and male aspects in a form like a hermaphrodite, like Hermes. His masculine aspect was Nun and the feminine, Nonet. And later depictions actually show him with female breasts. So after the original Apis died, a new one was found, and the bull itself symbolized resurrection. And in Heliopolis, here we go again, Byblos, the bull Menevis was dedicated to Osiris. So in the Temple of Knossos, you have a large bullfighting area dedicated to bull. Young men were encouraged to prove their manhood by successfully leaping the bull, which they call bull leaping. You can see in that fresco there, the young man is jumping like he had to grab the horns and then flip over it, do kind of like a handstand on it and hop off the bull. And on the National Geographic website, on the bull leaping, it states that's the most famous image of bull leaping, and it's actually in the palace at Knossos, and the fresco was painted around 1400 BCE, and he does that handspring or that flip over the charging bull, and you see the two women flanking the bull, and as I stated earlier, you can see how pale like they made them, and therefore you look at the young man and he's brown. So I thought that was very interesting that that's how they were represented. And so they worship the bull to the degree where they put it on their money, the pottery. You see the example of the pottery there, the frescoes, and the bull in Crete represented the sun and power of light, synonymous with Osiris, because of course he represents the sun overcome by night, who rises again the next morning. And they were a very advanced people. They had indoor plumbing. There's a picture you would see of the queen's bathroom, and she has a tub there. They also routinely repaired their homes after earthquakes. And the fact that everyone had left the island and no one had gotten killed or died during the last cataclysmic earthquake has some archaeologists thinking that they were able to predict earthquakes. So they left before that last earthquake came. And more striking is that they said they left Crete and went back across the Mediterranean. So I started thinking, I said, well, there's only one landmass on the other side of the Mediterranean. And I would even go so far as to say that they went back to Egypt. And this is why I would say that, because when this happened, this was a big event. They said there were even tsunamis and everything, and it was recorded as to what happened, but nothing was recorded about a foreign group of people coming to Egypt for refuge or asylum. Like nothing was recorded about that, which kind of tells me that not only were they familiar with them, but they probably considered them to be just an extension of them. And then in a Harrods article, it says the earliest writing in Crete dates to the early Bronze Age and was hieroglyphic. That was followed by a syllabic writing system called Linear A, which is one of the oldest in the world and still remains undeciphered. So I hope I've done an adequate job showing some connections and relationships between Africa and other regions such as Crete, the British Isles, so on and so forth. All the Bronze Age peoples wrote in some form of hieroglyphics, which originated in Central East Africa. As they spread north and out of Africa, they took the same basic elements, their advanced civilization with them to Crete, Canaan, Mesopotamia, Babylon, Anatolia, South, Central, and North America. They all built in stone. They all used tin and copper to make bronze. After beginning with copper, they were all involved in maritime commerce, with some becoming more distinguished than others, like the Phoenicians, aka the Canaanites, Carthaginians. Their languages have the same roots, which can still be found today, as linguists are making the connections between Hittite and Cushitic, Oromo, and rendering the myth of Indo-European origins to certain languages null and void. Plus, we have other implications, as Hebrew itself is a Proto-Canaanite language. So names are important, right? The willful distortion, misnaming, and obfuscation of the African and his descendants have separated him from his rightful inheritance. So I'm grateful that our Masonic rituals retain some hints to investigate some of these names to help lead us by the hand to the truth. And so here's my bibliography. There's a lot of stuff in there, man. I left a lot of stuff out. And those are my maps. And Dr. Ben says, names given to people, places, and things indiscriminately without regards to the traditions or cultures involved, that is providing the name changer or name giver is not the one whose culture and history are not part of the heritage being destroyed. Whew. I said a mouthful, huh? It's not escaping.
Good stuff, worshipful master. Good stuff. Thank you.
Yeah, and I should also say that was the focus for that was Black History Month, like when we came up with that whole idea. So that was the context and where I was.
Yeah, but y'all episodes was so powerful. We was like, we got to split it up, do a two-parter. So, man, I don't even know where to start because, like, as you're talking, I'm seeing the Masonic innuendos and the historical references to certain things when you go into esotericism that like, oh man, he's talking about this period in time. And I'm like, okay, this story goes along with this, alchemical primer or something, and well, not everybody knows, but the panelists know how my brain works. I'm psychotic at times. So as you're talking, I'm listening, I'm taking notes. I don't even know where I want to start at, but my question or one thing I noticed when the purple robes and you start talking about the purple and gold, then I noticed you mentioned RSM and RSM Royal Select Masters, but also I saw the value in it as somebody who's wearing purple and gold in the lodge or in the Masonic structure. When I start seeing royalty and I start seeing, when you're representing a district deputy, you a grandmaster, you anybody wearing that purple and gold, even in the Supreme Councils, you wearing these things. These are exemplary characters, and you're an exemplary person when you're wearing these things. And as a Mason, when we're telling lessons like this, our brothers giving an aspect of it, you should be looking at it as in Masonry. Hey, I've seen this color. What we need to be doing more is extracting things when we hear lectures and we hear lessons, even in our ritual, because these extractions, and I'm just pulling it out of your lecture on purple and gold, but this is what we need to bring it back to the basics inside our lodges. We need to teach our brothers, hey, when you hear certain things, think about that, go research that. And just hearing you talk, that made me think about my Masonic lessons and where I've seen this in Masonry, and I appreciate that. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, bro. I just wanted to bring something of value, man. And you're fully aware when we talk about the third and those guys, dipping off trying to get out of the country. Think about where they were trying to go.
They were seeking passage to Ethiopia. So,
exactly.
when you start looking, and that's what that's what I'm like, man, this is completely Masonic on a whole nother level. And you talking about the Bronze Age, and you're telling people, hey, these are these bullet words that you have, and you've tied it all back to ritual. So when people hear esotericism, they think of something spooky, but this is the esoteric side of Masonry right here, what you're talking about. You're tying it back to Ethiopia. You're tying it back to Phoenician. You're tying it back to the Hebrew, the languages that people spoke, and the passwords and things and stuff like that inside of the books that we got. So you're tying it directly back to Masonry. Brothers, if y'all paying attention to this episode, you better rewind it and watch it again.
Appreciate that, Pass.
Definitely. Yeah. I think there was one of the questions that came in the chat. Speaks about the Fertile Crescent. Africa being out of the Fertile Crescent. Could you expound on that a little bit?
Well, when they talk about the Fertile Crescent area, they are talking about basically Iran. They're talking about Mesopotamia, the Levant. Africa, well, I can't even say that because that's the whole continent. But even if we look at Egypt itself, it's not per se in that Fertile Crescent, because a lot of the fertility, if you all are aware as well, when we're talking about Egypt, comes from the flooding of the Nile. And that flooding is more pronounced as we get towards Lower Egypt, right? And you could even see the structure of Egypt over time set up that way. So when you get to the Lower Egypt part of it, which is the lower land, you'll see more of that flooding. You'll see more of the agriculture and all that taking place down there. When you get further into the Upper Egypt side, you have more structures, you have more of the arts and things like that taking place, the production taking place on that end. So I hope I answered that question.
Cool. Another question coming in from the chat. Can you revisit the point of Phoenicians also being called Ethiopians?
Okay. So as you can see in what I presented, they refer to themselves as such. And the Hebrews at the time, when they wrote about them, had mentioned that as well. They called them Ethiopians. And, historically, as we know, we want to call people by how they want to be named, and they'll say, I am this. So I had an issue with people going back and just giving people a name. Like, how many people have you heard about in history being named after a mythological being? Like that doesn't exist. But you have a whole nation of people who, as I said, were an advanced civilization on the island of Crete, and they named them after a mythological person. So I would prefer to refer to nations by the names that they call themselves.
Cool. Good. That's pretty good, man. This is good. And like Mike was saying, I think overall when we talk about esotericism, when we talk about the names, the words we use, and the ritual and things like that, seeing the origins, we talk about the Bronze Age. And the last time I think there was one of the panelists did something about Tubal Cain. We talk about that particular area of origin and what were those people called? Was it a group of people? Was it an actual word? Was it a god or a demigod or a deity that they call? You know what I'm saying? So when you go back to that history and that origin of that phrase, you begin to understand the history behind it and why it is used. Not just that it's just used. It's just it has an origin to it. It has a reason behind it. So this is good, man. This is good. I enjoyed it. It's great history. It's great history. And now we can see the collaboration between history and esotericism. That all blends together because now we see that origin of thought and where it comes from. Because as we know, the simple meaning of esotericism, it doesn't really matter the age and era. It could have been something as simple as them believing in a rock and calling that rock whatever, and they believe that rock made them better within. That's their esotericism. That's their history.
Yeah.
And that's what we're simply trying to explain to everybody at a most minimal, rudimentary concept. It is just the fact of you believe in this concept and you apply it to yourself and you make yourself better because of that. And that's it. So this is good. This is good, man.
Like I got to draw on some of the stuff you dropped on us earlier today. We were talking about how a certain shape in the sky, how it fits together and it brings all these things together. And you've got, and I know Mike was on this when he saw that there was 6 stars that formed that. I know he was like, what? But 6 specific stars, and it's not, as you said, it's not something that's overly deep. But if you're somebody who thinks, and you start to make these connections to things, you'll begin to understand the message that they were trying to give us, but they couldn't just come out and say it, so they had to put it in a certain form.
Right.
Make you do some work for it,
That's right.
Everything is saying that they speak in parables, man. Like everything, man, like from Buddhism to Christianity, everything. Buddha talked in parables. Islam. It's more of a romantic, it not romantic per se, but it puts it into a way where, it's a melody. Then, all these different languages and different nations that I've experienced as well. In Hindu, it's poetry, Rumi and Sufism, they used, that's why I said romance, because I read a lot of stuff on Rumi. So when you take these things into perspective, it's the language that it should be taught and learned in. As Brother House would say, you have to know those languages to understand. You can't just sit up here and use English translation of something to get a full interpretation of it, because these languages, they have a specific connotation taught to those people who know those languages and who are reading these things. So to grasp the full concept of the meaning of it, I can say, okay, I just read a book in English that said it was a leg, but when I read it in Japanese, it breaks it down a whole different way. It talks about the muscles, the tendons, and all of that in the leg just by the words used. So when we go back and turn this back into Masonry, we need to look at that from that aspect as well. What period of time were these things written so we can get a better interpretation? We may not have to have a full Phoenician alphabet understanding or Hebrew understanding of the entire language, but what these words mean and where they derive from and trying to get a better understanding of it will help you understand Masonry better instead of just saying, I'm reading this word. Because like you said, we're talking about the Bronze Age. Then another brother did a lecture on two-ball cane, and I was thinking the exact same thing, talking about the Canaanites. And then you start talking about the Phoenician alphabet, and the Phoenician alphabet giving birth to pretty much all the other languages that we know to date. So I'm looking at my notes. So then, like you talked about the Taurus, the bull, I start thinking about the zodiac, then the fixed zodiac positions, and then you diving into other houses again, just based on the certain things that we see, certain banners, and then then you go back to another country. You're talking about the Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, and then the aspects of the Middle Eastern culture. Then it's always going back to three. Nothing, it's always three principal beings and we got three principal seats. So tying it back to your lecture, you hit so many different points, so many different houses. I can't even imagine how you meticulously put this together like this.
It was hard, Mike. That's all I can say. You know what's the deepest thing about what you're saying is that when I was doing the work, I saw all of that too. And I was like, if I go into Indus Valley, if I go into Anatolia, man, that lecture would have been like 2 hours long, man. I had to really try to narrow it down because it's everything you said is true. Like when we think about the prominence of the bull, it was memorialized in the language. Like when we look at Aleph, what is Aleph? Isn't it a plow? Isn't it an ox?
Aleph is an ox in Hebrew, or the bull. Then you back to the banners. It's
exactly. So it's the first letter. If we think about it in the levels of priority, we're going to memorialize that as the first letter. You know what I mean? Because it's so prominent and it's so important to our culture. That's the first symbol we need to come up with. So it ties all that together, whether we're talking about Akkad, Sumer, Mesopotamia, all that stuff, it just grew out of the same letters and language.
Right. And each letter has a story to tell.
Exactly.
So you have to know the language and you have to know the story behind each letter.
Which explains now we want to tie in what we don't know. Think about the fact that the Egyptian hieroglyphs were indecipherable as well until folks came across the Rosetta Stone, right? So I don't know if the Cretan linear A or whatever is that much different. I don't know because I have to get into that and study that, but it's still indecipherable, just like the Mayan language was indecipherable, like Olmecs was indecipherable. So it kind of builds on what we're talking about. You have to be aware of the culture at that time, the context and how people spoke. As we would say in Egypt, there were 3 levels to the language, so you would see that basic, okay, this is what this is. But if you look at it on another level in context with the other symbols used around it, it had a whole different meaning, right? So I think part of that contributes to the fact as to why these things can't be deciphered, because A, you have the wrong people trying to decipher it. You know what I mean? And then B, they don't understand the context historically as to what's going on at that time.
You know, you reminded me of something that I heard Manly P. Hall in one of his lectures, and also at Samuel Vior lecture. They said that the people that were actually slaves in Egypt, they weren't slaves because they were physically being bound and cast. They were slaves because they didn't understand the language that was there. So they were mentally inapt to be a full Egyptian because they didn't know the hieroglyphs. So the story of Moses was that he stole the language and he taught his people, and that's how they became free.
Yeah.
But essentially, what Samuel Vior said was that the Hebrew alphabet was the language of the high priest inside the Egyptian temples. So that's some interesting things to dive in and research if y'all got time to check it out.
For sure.
That's good. One last question for you, Mr. Master. They asked, how do we further decipher the importance of the words in Masonry?
Study. You got to study the language. That's it. That's what I was told. And I wouldn't even act like I'm an expert, but just the levels of understanding I got from, as past Mike said, you see the word, right? You understand what the word is. And then you understand what the letters mean. As he said, every letter has a story. We could talk about bait and you say, okay, well, that's B. That's the basic level. But now when you start to view it as a house, right? You might start to view it as a womb. Now it takes on a whole different life.
It's good. That's good. That's good.
Right. And remember that the Bereshit bara ara Elohim. In a beginning. It started out with a ba, with a bait. So that womb giving birth, just as my big brother just said over here, my tall brother, I don't want to stand next to him because I feel short.
But you know what, Mike, you playing with fire then when you start talking about that ba and that ka. So was that really the language of the high priest? Something to think about.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. It's always further questions that we can dig into. So this was good, man. This was good. I think, and like I said, we always try to leave everybody with something to understand and connections to Masonry and esotericism and history. So we're making the connections, and this is great. But we thank you again, and we thank everybody for coming. Mike, you got the floor, sir.
You go ahead, take us out, but thank everyone for tuning in to this month's episode of Esoteric Lighthouse. Tune in next month. We got a special treat for you, so be on the lookout on all social media outlets because you're gonna be mind blown what we got in store for you.
That's right.
Talk to y'all later.
All right, good night, everybody.